Most freelancers believe their income rises or falls based on talent, effort, and market demand, yet there is a quieter force at work that almost no one talks about, a force that bends earnings downward even when skills improve and clients multiply. The mystery is not why some freelancers fail, but why so many succeed on paper and still struggle financially. If the system is truly open and global, why do independent workers across countries report the same pressures, the same instability, and the same invisible ceilings? The uncomfortable question is whether this instability is accidental, or whether it is quietly engineered. To understand that question, it helps to rewind before platforms, before remote work became normal, and before freelancer was rebranded as entrepreneurial freedom. Independent labor has existed for centuries, but modern freelancing emerged alongside deregulation and digital markets that promised efficiency. The narrative was simple and seductive: remove middlemen, let talent meet demand directly, and income will naturally follow value. Yet history rarely rewards such simplicity, and the structures built around these promises often tell a different story. In the late 20th century, governments and corporations faced a problem that was never framed as one. Full-time employment came with obligations, protections, pensions, healthcare, and collective bargaining power. Independent contractors, by contrast, carried their own risk. Laws were gradually adjusted to encourage flexible labor, not by openly stripping protections, but by redefining work itself. This redefinition would become the foundation upon which modern freelancing rests. Tax codes were among the first tools quietly reshaped. Independent workers were classified as businesses rather than labor, shifting the burden of social contributions entirely onto the individual. What appeared to be neutrality was actually asymmetry. Employers saved on benefits and payroll taxes, while freelancers absorbed volatility without the leverage to negotiate compensation that truly reflected that risk. The law did not forbid freelancers from earning more, but it subtly ensured they would need to earn more just to stand still. As the internet expanded, platforms stepped in as intermediaries that claimed to eliminate intermediaries. They standardized contracts, payments, dispute resolution, and visibility, while insisting they were merely neutral marketplaces. This distinction mattered legally because it allowed platforms to avoid responsibility for income stability while exercising significant control over pricing, ranking, and access to clients. The rules were written to preserve this ambiguity, and courts often upheld it. In the early rise of freelance platforms, income stories looked promising. Early adopters faced little competition and could command strong rates. Governments pointed to these success stories as proof that flexible labor worked. What went unnoticed was that these systems depended on scarcity. Once scale arrived, the dynamics shifted. Platforms optimized for volume, not sustainability, and the legal frameworks allowed them to do so without accountability. As global participation increased, wages began to converge downward. This was not simply competition, it was engineered exposure. Freelancers were legally positioned as isolated sellers in a global auction, unable to collectively bargain without risking accusations of price fixing. Labor laws that protected employees from such dynamics did not apply. The same law that defined freelancers as free actors also denied them collective defense. Payment systems added another layer. Delayed payouts, mandatory escrow, conversion fees, and compliance checks were justified as security measures. Individually, each rule seemed reasonable. Together, they created cash flow instability that disproportionately harmed small, independent workers. Large clients could wait, freelancers could not. The law rarely addressed timing asymmetry, focusing instead on gross amounts rather than usable income. The breaking point came quietly, not with a crash but with normalization. Freelancers began reporting longer hours for the same pay, rising administrative burdens, and shrinking margins. Surveys across continents showed similar results despite different cultures and markets. The cause and effect chain was clear but rarely acknowledged. Laws designed for businesses were being applied to individuals, while protections designed for labor were withheld. When governments noticed the strain, their responses often worsened it. New compliance requirements were introduced under the banner of fairness or tax enforcement, increasing paperwork without increasing bargaining power. Platforms passed these costs down to freelancers. The logic was circular. Because freelancers were businesses, they needed regulation. And because they were regulated, They were treated less like workers. Attempts to reclassify freelancers as employees surfaced periodically, sparking backlash from companies and even from some freelancers fearful of losing flexibility. What went unspoken was that the system had already removed meaningful flexibility in exchange for risk. Legal battles focused on classification labels rather than on income stability, ensuring that the core problem remained untouched. The fallout was subtle but widespread. Freelancers began stacking gigs, working across time zones, and accepting unfavorable terms just to maintain visibility. Burnout increased, savings rates declined. The supposed independence translated into personal risk absorption at scale. This was not a failure of individual planning, but a predictable outcome of structural design. Failed fixes followed predictable patterns. Governments introduced minimum platform standards that lacked enforcement teeth. Platforms offered optional benefits funded by freelancers themselves. Financial institutions marketed high-interest credit products as solutions to irregular income. Each fix treated symptoms while preserving the underlying legal architecture. Modern data reveals how consistent these patterns are. Studies show that a significant portion of freelancers earn below local median wages after expenses, despite working comparable hours. Income volatility remains high year over year. The same legal definitions appear across jurisdictions, producing similar outcomes regardless of market maturity. This repetition is not coincidence. The most shocking parallel is how closely these systems resemble historical piecework labor, where workers were paid per output without guarantees. Those systems were eventually regulated out of existence in many countries due to exploitation. Freelancing revived the model under a different name, protected by updated legal language and digital interfaces. Technology did not create the problem, it amplified it. Algorithms replaced foremen, but the power imbalance remained. Laws treated algorithmic decisions as business processes rather than labor management, shielding them from scrutiny. Freelancers could be deranked or removed without explanation, and legal recourse was limited. Cause and effect continued to reinforce itself. Lower income stability pushed freelancers to accept worse terms, validating platform assumptions that lower prices were acceptable. This, in turn, attracted clients seeking cost savings rather than value, further depressing rates. The system trained participants to behave in ways that justified its own constraints. As more professionals entered freelancing out of necessity rather than choice, the narrative of freedom grew thinner, yet the laws remained unchanged, because the system technically worked. Work was being done, taxes were collected, platforms grew. The absence of visible collapse allowed quiet harm to persist. Looking at modern parallels, similar dynamics are emerging in creator economies, gig delivery, and remote consulting. Different labels, same legal logic, independent status without independent power, flexibility without security, growth without income resilience. The pattern repeats because the incentives remain aligned against change. 3 takeaways emerge clearly from this history. First, income instability among freelancers is not primarily a personal failure, but a structural outcome of legal definitions. Second, platforms and markets behave rationally within the rules given to them, even when those rules produce harmful results. Third, reform efforts that ignore bargaining power will continue to fail. The warning is not that freelancing is doomed, but that without legal evolution, the same pressures will intensify. As artificial intelligence increases supply and automation shifts demand, downward pressure will accelerate under existing frameworks. The mystery resolves into a choice: whether societies treat independent work as labor deserving protection, or as businesses absorbing risk alone. The open-ended question is whether freelancers will remain fragmented participants in a system designed for scale, or whether new forms of representation and law will emerge. History suggests change is possible, but never automatic. It requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about who benefits from the current design. If this story challenged your assumptions, the next step is not panic but awareness. Understanding the structure clarifies the strategy. Pay attention to laws, not just platforms. Watch for patterns, not promises. And if you found value in this breakdown, subscribe for deeper analysis, share this video with someone navigating independent work, and stay curious about the systems shaping your income long before a client ever clicks hire.